Hello and welcome to my channel. The title of this video is An Introduction to the Spanda Karikas, Part 1. Introduction. The subject of this video will be a study in the classic tantric text, the Spanda Karikas. This is Part 1, which covers Section 1, verses 1 through 11. This is roughly 1/3 of the entire text. This is an introductory study to familiarize the viewer with the text itself and the basic concepts it teaches. For those who may wish to pursue this further, I recommend two works which are the sources for this video. The first is Spanda Karikas, The Divine Creative Pulsation by Jaideva Singh. This is available online as a free PDF. I have placed the link in the notes below. With that, I have written the text of the aphorisms in the hope that this will aid the viewer to follow the work more closely. The second work is Yoga Spanda Karikas by Daniel Odier. While very different, these works complement each other. Singh's approach is very academic and could be described as oriented towards the broader metaphysics, while Odier brings this more into the personal realm. If viewers have comments, corrections, or refinements to add to this basic introduction, please do so in the comments section below. I welcome them, including arguments, since I like to fight. I am not a Swami or priest sitting here speaking to you from the heights of authority. This work is based on my own study, and there is certainly room for me to grow. I urge the viewer to research these matters on your own, and with your own thought and meditation, reach your own conclusions. Historical overview. The Spanda Karikas itself is a text, is one of the most important in the Tantric canon and to the movement of Kashmir Shaivism. This is a system of absolute idealism which emerged from the oral into the written record in roughly the 5th century AD in the Kashmir region of the subcontinent. There is some debate about the poet who composed and who may have assembled these aphorisms in verse form. Many attribute it to the sage Vasugupta, who received the Shiva Sutra according to tradition, while others see it as a later work. The Spanda Karikas has been the subject of a number of commentaries since the Middle Ages. Jaideva Singh's work draws heavily from several of the more well-known thinkers. Definition: Spanda. In this work, I will attempt to avoid the use of technical Sanskrit terms as much as possible, since it can be confusing for some viewers. However, there are simple words which, like shorthand, can be used for wider concepts. One of these which the viewer should know is Spanda. This is central to the current study. What is Spanda? Fundamentally, Spanda means vibration. Odier translates this word as sacred tremor, but there are wide vistas to this little word. Lord Shiva is the absolute, and the absolute is consciousness. The Shiva Sutra begins teaching us that everything is consciousness. This everything means all things or objects in the field of time and space on which they are active, which emerges from Lord Shiva. In this universe of objects, he is the sole subject. These objects arise from him by means of Spanda, the divine will. Spanda is the power of the Supreme Lord unfolding through levels of vibration by means of which he is conscious of himself. This is also called Shakti in the Tantric tradition and Viraj in the Vedas. This vibration is the goddess. Everything we see and experience is her. The one who truly experiences this, however, is Lord Shiva, or consciousness. In the classical iconography of Lord Shiva, he is portrayed as meditating in deep silence. This unmoved stillness is representative of the experient, Lord Shiva passively witnessing the unfolding of all events through all the worlds in the eternal present. Two imperfect metaphors will help us conceptualize this relationship between Lord Shiva and his energy, also called his will, which is Spanda. Traditionally, if we think of the ocean as consciousness, then the Spanda is the movement of the waves. The waves rise to various heights and whirlpools plunge to different depths from the strife of currents churning the waters. But all of this is transitory as the bubbles of foam that gurgle on the edges of the tide. All arises and all is dissolved again. But the ocean itself experiences this all without attachment and is unchanged in itself. The distinction between consciousness and its energetic activity is not as wide as that presented in the ocean metaphor. It is more subtle, since consciousness is said to move and yet not move from the activity of Spanda. We find similar concepts in modern physics. Metaphorically, we could approach this as quantum superposition. This means that a particle can be in two states at the same time. The division between Lord Shiva and the goddess is an abstraction. The Supreme Lord is unmoved, yet alive, with creative pulsation. It is here that Kashmir Shaivism has one of its greatest divisions with Advaita Vedanta, which is also non-dual monism. The Absolute, or Brahman, there is cold and unaware. Lord Shiva, however, is understood as a massive bliss who is continually manifesting teeming, uncounted universes through the spastic joy of his union with the goddess. Text of the Spanda Karikas, Section 1, verses 1 to 11. Verse 1, quote, "We laud that Shankar, by whose mere opening and shutting of the eyelids there is the appearance and dissolution of the world, and who is the source of the glorious powers of the collective whole of the Shaktis, the divine energy in various forms." Unquote. The first aphorism of the text begins by praising the primeval seed of all, Shankar, who is Lord Shiva. Consciousness is the very heart of being. This idea of the heart of being is often thought of as some distant point in space where it all began. There, perhaps, ancient suns still glow with the pale light of the Big Bang. Others conceive of this as a rarefied mental state locked away in the 11th dimension and only accessible to those who possess the occult keys of sacred geometry or perhaps passwords from those Pleiadians. In an absolute sense, they are all wrong, although in themselves these may serve as paths to reach that recognition. The very highest level of being is not removed from us at all. We are that consciousness. I would suggest a thought experiment to assist the viewer in testing this for yourself. Try for a moment to recall your earliest memory, no matter how brief. If you have a flash of memory before you were verbal, that is all the better. Now, think of yourself through the chain of years. Remember for a moment attitudes and beliefs you held at different ages and how your body felt. Briefly, re-experience in your mind moments you were very ill, in high states of joy, frothing with rage, as well as being drunk or losing consciousness. Through the flow of time and experience, everything changes. Your mind, that stream of inner chatter, knowledge, and held concepts, as well as your body. But one thing remains untouched. This is the silent witness to all these thoughts and experiences within you. Remember, you are not your thoughts. You witness them. You are not your body or your emotions. You experience them. Your mind is not a detached data stream in the physical body like a wire. Something in you is witnessing and experiencing both phenomena. This is the I consciousness within you. No physical or biochemical change, no shift of mental state can reach this. It is always present, always unchanged. As Lord Krishna tells Arjuna using the words Atman for the self or consciousness, quote, "The Atman is never born, nor does he ever die, nor once having been does the Atman cease to be. Unborn, eternal, everlasting, primeval. He is not killed when the body is killed. As a man casting away worn-out garments takes on new ones, so the dweller in the body, casting away worn-out bodies, takes on others that are new. Weapons cannot cut him, nor can fire burn him. Water cannot make him wet, nor can wind dry him." Unquote. This is not what we classically call the ego. The ego is shaped from pre-existing material by outside forces and is subject to change. This psychic structure is an evolutionary creation from innate genetic resources, culture, and the external biography of a life. This is the empirical ego. At your earliest memories as a child in the pre-verbal or early verbal state, it is not yet completely formed. Memory can be older than the imperial ego. Thus, it cannot be this phantom witness in the shadows. This witness is called the experient with a capital E or the self with a capital S. The experient in me when I first conceived these words, and the experient in you as you hear them is the same entity. The experient in us is the same as that in the first humans who looked up at the stars, as well as in Lord Ganesha and all beings in all realms. This is the same experient which saw the flash which began our universe. As the Atharva Veda says, therefore, whoever knows man regards him as Brahman's self. Unquote. There is only one experient. With this basic idea of who Shankar is, we continue and are told by the poet about him and that he is the one by whose mere opening and closing of the eyelids there is the appearance and dissolution of the world. Commentators see in this metaphoric activity of opening the eyelids an indication not only of the power of the Supreme Lord in creation, but his absolute freedom as well. Creation and destruction are merely the proverbial blink of an eye, perhaps the simplest gesture of the animal body. It is also one which, under normal circumstances, is without restriction. Freedom is a key trait of Lord Shiva. Because he is absolute, he inherently transcends categorization and determination. No matter how we conceptualize consciousness, it is always beyond that construct because it is not reducible to an object. This is illustrated in a famous tale in the Puranas, which are the Hindu literature containing legends of religious and historic nature. There was once a group of strictly orthodox sages living in seclusion in the forests practicing austerities. Pleased with their devotion, Lord Shiva decided to appear to them. He did so in a completely unorthodox manner, completely naked and sensually dancing. Offended, the sages did not recognize him, as he did not conform to their conception of him, which was that of the austere Ida Yogi, the first yogi. Thus, the Supreme Lord shattered this limited conception they had of him. As the legend shows, he is not only free to act as he may choose, but we are free to reach out to him as empirical individuals or egos in a manner in which we can relate to him. And ultimately, the identification with consciousness of the self will raise us beyond that mythological limitation. Another interpretation of these lines of opening and closing of the eyelids, as well as appearance and dissolution, sees them as a reference to the manifestation of the primal duality of the pair of opposites which characterizes our empirical world of experience. But this reality, that is much like the rising and falling of the waves, which give the appearance of height and depth as opposite states, when in fact they are nothing but the ocean. The duality is transitory, hence not real in itself. The metaphysical ground and material are the same, consciousness. To personalize this in another example to demonstrate the point, if the transportation system of the city of San Francisco where I live, the disreputable Muni, is late, I can become highly agitated. But when I meditate, I am calm. Both are equally me, and the appearance that they are two distinct personalities is only transitory. That which makes this creation and destruction possible is the will of Lord Shiva, which the poet here calls the glorious powers of the collective Shaktis, the divine energies, or the divine creative vibration, which is Spanda, the goddess. She creates and transforms the primal sounds into the music to which Lord Shiva listens. Verse 2, quote, "Inasmuch as nothing can veil his nature, there cannot be his obstruction anywhere in whom this world rests and from whom it comes forth." Because consciousness is everything, there is nothing that can truly obstruct it, no matter how the Spanda is expressed. Among the many names for Lord Shiva, he is called Sarvachari because he is ever alert and loves to wander everywhere, and Durvasa, as he cannot be clad, for he is clad in space. Both epitaphs express the sentiments of this second verse. When the poet tells us the world rests in him and emerges from him, he is speaking from the vantage point of the empirical individual within the limitations of natural language. From the purer perspective, this is not the case, as he is the metaphysical ground and form of all that exists. The relationship should not be understood as if the world were a piece of bacon cooked into a cosmic quiche Lorraine. The universe we know and all the realms that exist are not a piece or pieces of consciousness. They are not superimposed on it, nor is consciousness an emergent entity arising from the unity of all pieces. All is Lord Shiva. What follows from this is that everything is an epitome of everything else. This is much like how, in a hologram, one piece contains the whole. The English poet William Blake captured this in his famous lines from Auguries of Innocence. Quote, "To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of our hand, and eternity in an hour." Unquote. We perceive ourselves as limited because of our fluctuating focus and identification with the mind, with the weight of its biography, even from multiple lives, and the body. But in fact, as the experient, we are the seed of the universe. To perceive the world around us, or the far distant nebula, and the forest of unknown realms as spaces outside of ourselves as who we really are, is only an artificial construct of thought. It is a mistake of the mind. Swami Laksmanjoo writes on this matter in his work on the Shiva Sutra. Quote, "Because of the thought, I am this whole universe, whatever objects he, the enlightened yogi, perceives in the objective world, whether it exists internally or externally, he perceives as one of the limbs of his own body of I consciousness being. So, by the achievement of supreme I consciousness, the yogi experiences this universe in an undifferentiated way." Unquote. Thus, we may be aware of Spanda in any manner or place and uncover the one behind it. This may be through the experience of love or hate, as they are all eddies of the same stream. This thought is continued in the next verse. Verses 3 and 4. Quote, "Even though different states like waking, sleeping, and unconsciousness occur, the Spanda principle remains the same. The Spanda principle never departs from its own nature as the identical experient is in all different states. I am happy, I am miserable, I am attached. These and other cognitions have their being evidently in another, in which the various states of happiness, misery, etc. are all strung together." Unquote. In reading these lines, I am put in mind of the famous composition by the British poet Shelley entitled Mount Blanc. Quote, "The everlasting universe of things flows through the mind and rolls its rapid waves, now dark, now glittering, now reflecting gloom, now lending splendor where from secret springs the source of human thoughts its tribute brings, of waters, with a sound but half its own. Such a feeble brook will oft assume, in the wild rocks among the mountain lone, where waterfalls around it leap forever, where woods and winds contend, and a vast river over its rocks ceaselessly bursts and raves." Unquote. There, in the cold heights, the young poet, overwhelmed with the sense of awe and beauty, grasped this Ariadne's thread of Spanda within the rising of this experience and touched upon a revelation. This is how the goddess reveals herself. The alteration of light and shadow playing against the silent and eternal background of the white mountain is the flow of states of consciousness which appear to be opposites, but are united as aspects of the experient. Some states are light and joyful, others dark and sad. But all are unified within the stony heights. The witness, symbolized by Mount Blanc, is also the secret from which things spring, this alteration of human thought. This is but half our own, as it is concealed within the illusion of duality. Shelley sees each of us is a trickle, a small stream of the river, or man is a microcosm. He stopped just short of the realization that we are that river, as well as the mountain, not just the interplay of opposites. But, none the same, he communicated it as this is how the Spanda rose through him. The Spanda Karikas teaches us that these flowing mental states of waking, dreaming, and consciousness, with all their tones, are illuminated by the light from which they arise, much like refracted colors through the prism of illusion. The expansive fourth state is the primordial white light. It is always present, though we are generally not settled in it. This state is called Turiya. Because this fourth state is the canvas upon which the colors of the other states and their tones of feelings are painted in shifting light, the experient who dwells in Turiya cannot be tarnished by them. He is what binds them together, for they are him. Consciousness witnesses all, and to him it is all an expression of himself as Spanda. This is why Lord Shiva is called Bholenath, he who is innocent and easy to please. For him, it's all good, because to him all things are expressions of his own joy, the bliss of being. The Imperial Ego, or empirical, perhaps that was some parapraxis there, may be happy or sad, a saint or a sinner, but to him it is all eddies in the eternal river of his own being. One of the many implications of this is that we must accept ourselves where we are in life, in our own development, and work with the whole of our being to recognize the self. And this, of course, is certainly not easy. Certainly, as individuals, we all follow different paths and emphasize different aspects of the Spanda. But ultimately, to denigrate any aspect of existence, such as the body, is to denigrate the goddess, who is the energy from which this arises. Verse 5, quote, "When in neither pain nor pleasure, nor object nor subject exist, nor wherein does insentiency exist, there, in the highest sense, is the Spanda principle." Unquote. The focus of these verses is to teach that neither physical nor psychological states are the highest reality. By including the word insentiency, which is an allusion to some Buddhist meditative practice and beliefs, the poet is expanding the state to clarify to us that no etheric, astral, or metaphysical states one may experience can be the highest state either. Even the most rarefied states of consciousness are just that, of, meaning belonging to consciousness in the genitive, and not pure consciousness itself. Consciousness is what witnesses them. They are not the fourth state, which is the ground of experience. In seeking experiences in all these aspects of existence, whether they are physical, psychological, or transcendental experiences of deep meditation, we pursue what we perceive as lost. We may conceptualize this lost treasure in a million ways. For the Spaniards seeking El Dorado's gold, to Puritans seeking to build the ideal city on the hill, or white-collar managers going to Brazil to take ayahuasca. Some think this can be found in lands such as India or Israel. But the gold is not the experience unless it leads one to Shelley's secret source of human thought, the one who is actually witnessing the event, the experient. This is why these endeavors ultimately fail. One may spend years in training and meditation to stop the inner chatter of neurons flashing in the brain to touch upon what is characterized as the void. But this is not liberation. Liberation is recognizing oneself as that which is experiencing or witnessing the void. The void is, logically, still an object. The self of the experient can never be reduced to an object, as it is the sole subject within. As Christ tried to teach the Pharisees, who dreamed of wielding Roman power with the coming of the Messiah, quote, "The kingdom of God is within you," unquote. And in recognizing this, it will then be seen everywhere, like the philosopher's stone of alchemy, which is obtainable everywhere, but not recognized. Verses 6 and 7. The principle which should be examined with great care and reverence is that by which this group of senses, though insentient, acts as a sentient force by itself, and along with the inner group of senses goes towards objects, takes pleasure in their maintenance, and withdraws into itself, because this natural freedom of it prevails everywhere. Unquote. The external group of senses in these verses are the 5 physical senses we experience daily. This is clear-cut. The inner group of senses is characterized by various ways in the commentators. Many of these would be regarded as archaic or mythological to modern viewers. This is a secondary detail, since the function is the same regardless of how they may be understood. The inner senses construct our perception. If you gaze out at the room where you are sitting at this moment, the objects in 3-dimensional space with their attributes which you perceive are not what exist in fact. This vision is largely an inner construction. Dr. Lanza, in his work Biocentrism, and in subsequent interviews, has pointed out that it would be a simple matter of tweaking some neurons in the brain to perceive everything which is red as vibrating, when in reality neither the color nor vibration are true attributes of the object. The poet of the Spanda Karikas would probably agree with this, but that is not necessarily the main point here. He is outlining the structure to tell us that both the inner and outer group of senses naturally draw our focus towards the external and away from the internal, which is the penetralium of the experient. But for this world we perceive to be real, it must still be witnessed in order to have a ground of manifestation. There can be no waves without water. They draw us away from the experient by creating the illusion of differentiation and diversity. Within consensus reality, this certainly seems to be the case, and this reality clearly limits our possibilities. On average, one cannot simply decide by an act of will to fly. But, to be critical for a moment, if the world is only the vibration of Spanda and so plastic, then why not? If to rise and to fall are only different and perhaps we may even say arbitrary manifestations of the same energy, then why not be able to fly at will? Why should there be a consensus reality at all? An answer to this, I would like to touch briefly on the theory of appearances within Kashmir Shaivism. The theory of appearance. All the worlds and realms that exist in the continually unfolding fractal of being are an ideal projection of Lord Shiva through his will, which is Spanda. They are not relative individual fabrications such as in Buddhist and New Age thought. One of the axioms of the New Agers is you create your own reality. This is foundational to all positive thinking movements. This turns on the question, who is you here? Are you the empirical ego, as most think, or are you the experient? In the popular literature, the ego, as that which makes life choices, is clearly what is meant by this nostrum. Let's study this in another thought experiment. We have a 70-year-old Klansman in a leaky cabin somewhere in the backwoods of Kentucky. He has never learned to read, has one lung, one eye, and stutters, but through his positive affirmations, he should, theoretically to New Agers, be able to be elected President of the United States. I admit I'm being mildly polemical here, but this is an expression of the subjective idealism which is found in Buddhism and its little sister, the New Age movement. Its problem is that there are 7 billion little subjective idealists, all with conflicting affirmations, some wildly divergent and schizophrenic, bumping against each other, not to mention other levels of existence active behind the scenes, zapping us with their own affirmations. It also ignores karma, because this can affect manifestation and magic. The empirical ego does not have limitless freedom of choice. We perform this action, which is one of those of Lord Shiva, but only in a limited way. Tantra and Kashmir Shaivism teach absolute idealism. There is one subject, Lord Shiva, and these are his worlds to dream, not those of individual monads any more than characters in your own dream, unless externally projected, really act independently of the dreamer's mind in that state. This is why there is a consensus reality. The implication of such a position is that the world is objective and real, but only so far as the appearance stretches. For those of us within the hologram, it is perfectly real for all intent and purposes, though not the full story of reality. The trick is to realize what is the field from which the energy arises to be assembled into these forms. A traditional and somewhat imperfect metaphor for this is that of a mirror. All the objects which appear within the mirror seem to be real, but they are still part of the mirror. Eye consciousness, or the experient, is both the glass of the mirror and the objects which emerge within it that are perceptible to our senses. Verse 8, quote, "The empirical ego cannot drive the goad of desire, but by coming into contact with the power of the self, it becomes equal to the principle," unquote. This verse continues with the subject of the senses from the last aphorism. The main teaching here is that because the empirical ego is outwardly focused, away from the experience and the awareness of Spanda, he is unable to break through the vision presented by the senses or to direct them. This is because his awareness is trapped within their artificial constructs. Metaphorically, It is not unlike the situation of the main character in Coleridge's famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. At the darkest point, he was trapped on a ship of the dead upon an oily, flat sea teeming with creeping creatures without a wind or spirit and dying of thirst. In the poem, it is only when the mariner, acting spontaneously from his inner self beyond the mind, blessed these things unaware, and then prayed to the Blessed Virgin Mary, a form of the goddess, that his situation was transformed. What once had bound him, the sea, then brought him to salvation, represented by the harbor. Pardon me. The situation is the same for us. We must first learn to recognize and then connect with the flow of Spanda. The goddess alone, who bears the double axe, one blade of which binds and one blade of which liberates, can free us. Verse 9. Quote, when the perturbations of that empirical ego who is incapacitated by his own impurity and is attached to action disappears, then the highest states appears. Unquote. To many listeners, especially those raised in cultures influenced by the Abrahamic faiths, it is an unquestioned assumption that the terms impurity and sin are equal. Impurity is understood as the result of an action which violates codes of moral or religious conduct. In the Tantric tradition, this is not the case. Impurity is ignorance of the nature of the self as the experient. Thus, impurity creates bondage because it obstructs the light of consciousness from shining forth through all the states of consciousness. The more analytically oriented listening to this will immediately object that this definition flatly contradicts earlier verses in the text. The poet told us in verse 2, nothing can veil his nature. One commentator writes on this verse, quote, nothing can obstruct him even in the state of the world, for the self as Lord Shiva has a nature which cannot be veiled, unquote. So, how then is there even any impurity at all? It is true that nothing, as in no object or thing, can veil the nature of the Supreme Lord unless it is the Supreme Lord himself. This is an aspect of his absolute freedom, to conceal himself in himself with himself as an artificial impurity. He does this because this is his sport, to create himself as the bound or empirical individual in an unlimited number of conditions and untold number of types of beings, and then in each thread to rediscover himself as himself. This is the game of Shiva. We all must play the game as him against the goddess or Spanda, who creates our conditions. We do nothing but lose for countless lifetimes until we realize at the end that we've won all along. The divine play of Lord Shiva falls into two basic movements. The first is the gradual descent of consciousness into insentient matter, which seems to be the farthest from the eternal light and bliss of the divine. This is done through 36 layers of acculturations of impurity. In the Lurian Kabbalah, the technical Hebrew term for this is tzimtzum. Once this distant point is reached, the second movement is the unfelt but irresistible gravity in a pull back to self-recognition as consciousness. Returning to the impurity, which is the field where the game of Shiva is played, in traditional tantric analysis, it falls into three primary categories. 1, limited individuality, empirical ego. 2, duality. 3, karma. 1, limited individuality, the empirical ego. This impurity is considered to be the root. It is the identification of the experient with the transient artificial construct of the empirical ego. This causes the individual bound soul to perceive himself as limited by conditions. Among these conditions are physical nature, economic value, social status, a moral state, a religious faith, and many, many others. But all of these are many labels that can be reduced to two basic categories, which are imperfections and distinctions. For the most part, this basically defines the human condition as we know it. When we analyze this more closely, we see how it unfolds. When we conceive of ourselves as imperfect, then the natural tendency is to desire that which we believe will make us perfect. In this, we hope to recover what we mistakenly believe is a lost state of wholeness. Invariably, these are either objects or states onto which we project that subterranean longing for the unity and perfection of the experient. But because this is obscured, it is misdirected outwardly. After all, this is where our senses are programmed to take us. Should we acquire the desired paraphernalia or wear the mask of the state we pursue, this will never fail to eventually break from the weight of the burdens we hang upon them, our unknown desire for wholeness. Duality. The second fundamental impurity is duality. This is the sensation that the limited empirical ego is separated from the rest of existence. This is the basis of such worldviews as that we are only Epicurean atoms flowing blindly through space, as we find, for example, in Lucretius. In this view, men are finite biological machines struggling against each other for resources in a dead cosmos. The other, against whom we must overcome to survive, is the threat. Another form of this is when we identify with transient psychological states which we label based on cultural norms such as positive or negative. We are also drawn away from the self in a desire to conform to the external and historically conditioned standard of the good. Sometimes those who are the most moral are the furthest from spirituality, though they could not conceive this to be the case. Karma. The third basic impurity is that of action, called by the familiar Sanskrit word karma. In his monumental work, which I highly recommend, Kashmir Shaivism, Professor Mishra defines this word. Quote, "Karma is voluntary action that we perform by exerting our will and that arises out of the sense of want or lack in us." Unquote. In the West, the concept of karma is usually understood in a negative sense of what goes around comes around. So if I'm mean to someone online, then I have to reincarnate so they can be mean to me. In reality, karma is about desire much more than punishment per se. Although this is a broad subject, I will note here. Let's look theoretically at an historical example. Mary Tudor, or Bloody Mary, wanted more than anything to have a baby. This desire arose because she believed that this would make her life complete as a woman and a sovereign. Because it was not fulfilled, this desire would serve to cause her to reincarnate. The problem for her would no doubt be the fact that she was responsible for a tremendous amount of terror and suffering. This will, among other things, limit the possibilities for her to fulfill her desire and may taint it. One way this could unfold is that she would have her baby, but wish that she did not. The opposite of this type of action, which arises from the waking mental state, is the spontaneous activity of the self. A literary and artistic example of this can be found in Wagner's opera Parsifal. The only way to redeem the suffering of the tainted, we could say impure, Grail King was through the simple and spontaneous act of a noble heart. This is an expression of the self, or to quote the chorus, durch Mitleid wiesen der reiner Tor. When the hero accomplishes this act and restores what was lost, the symbol of the wholeness of the experient, the divine grace is once more manifest. Impurities are not morally evil. One of the key differences between Tantra and other religious and philosophical systems is that the impurities which blend together to form the mist of Maya or illusion are not, and nor is illusion, regarded as evil or dark. The impurities should not be read as a form of the Christian doctrine of original sin, which sees a gulf of division between a holy God and a corrupt human. Remember, this net of illusion is the activity of Spanda. It is an expression of the will of the Supreme Lord, thus is the goddess. To condemn it is only to fall into the trap of duality and ultimately to denigrate aspects of ourselves. Verses 10 and 11. Quote, "Then will flash forward his innate nature characterized by cognition and activity, by which he, the experient, then knows and does all that is desired by him. How this accursed way of life and death could be his any longer, who stands struck with amazement as he observes that nature, Spanda, which presides over all the activity of life." Unquote. These verses discuss some phenomena associated with crossing the threshold into the supreme state. This is the identification with the experient as the true self. The sense of distinction between the microcosm and the macrocosm vanishes once the hairs of a maiden's beard which form our limitations are burned away in the flashing of the light of consciousness. Section 3 of the Shiva Sutra focuses on this process in the related experiences and pitfalls in some detail. This aphorism tells us about this. The experient then knows and does all that is desired by him, meaning that by relaxing into the unfolding of Spanda, he rediscovers his true nature as divine knowledge and activity. Because of this, the cycle of birth and death no longer bind him, and all possibilities are open to him, as the divine freedom is now his own. One of the attributes of the classical goddess Hecate, who is a manifestation of Kali Ma, is that she is in possession of the keys. These keys are our experiences, the surging or retraction of Spanda, which she can either lock to bind us further or unlock to liberate us. Practically, it is here that Tantra focuses. The classic text, the Vijnana Bhairava, outlines 112 practices of various types to center the awareness to become attuned to Spanda. One of these suggests, quote, "Wherever the mind finds satisfaction, let it be fixed there, for there itself the nature of supreme bliss will become manifest," unquote. It is the simplest experiences, those which are repeated through the day while they are drowned out by the white noise of inner chatter from the empirical ego, that can unfold into the divine. If, that is, we undress them with that desire and realize that these simple joys are footprints of the bliss which characterizes consciousness in its pure state. Daniel Odier writes, quote, "The ideal of the Tantrika is to find the absolute right here within everyday life. It is not retreat or an altered state of consciousness," unquote. This is a far cry from the Buddhists who equate passion with suffering, or the Vedantins in pursuit of their own ideal of the holy coma, as Dr. Pillai has called it. For many, these are certainly valid paths, although there is a danger in them because of their denigration of the human condition to foster duality and self-deluded holiness. True liberation is for the heart, which is always the key to discover that there is not a gulf between the sacred and the profane. What we perceive as either one of these is only the vibration of consciousness unfolding according to the divine will as Spanda. I hope that this will prove to be food for thought and helpful. Thank you.